So in this session, we will, after this short introduction, have a number of speeches from His Excellency Colin Crooks, the UK ambassador to the Republic of Korea, who will speak about the Glasgow legacy. And after that, we'll move to His Excellency Khaled Abdulrahman Hassan, the Egyptian ambassador to the Republic of Korea, who will speak as the incoming COP27 president on what's at stake in Sharm el-Sheikh. And then we'll also have the pleasure of having with us Her Excellency Yoon Jenny Kim, the Republic of Korea's climate change ambassador. And finally, I hope that we'll manage to be joined online by Madame Madeleine Sarr Diouf, the UNFCCC LDC chair for the upcoming negotiations, who is from Senegal and who will be joining us online. And following those speeches, and depending on how things go, I hope we'll have a chance to have some short discussion among our key speakers as well. We'll have a discussion panel that I'll introduce to you later. But with that, if you're ready, Master Crooks, are you ready to kick it off? Can I hand it over to you?
Thank you very much, Frank. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, to those of you joining this session today as part of GGGI's Global Green Growth Week. I've got something on here saying unmute myself. Am I audible? I'm audible. Great, thank you. Terrific. Well, I'm delighted to talk to you today anyway about the Glasgow legacy. In the 3 years since the UK was announced as hosts of COP26, an already complex agenda has become, frankly, even more complex. The science of climate change, the scale of innovation required to achieve net zero, the role of finance, the all of society nature of the transition required, the importance of just transitions, and the important voices of those on the front lines of the crisis. All of this was challenging to comprehend, let alone respond to in the first place. But the complexity has been compounded by the threat to energy security following Russia's brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine and the inflation, rising debt and food insecurity which have followed. It's not for me to tell those of you witnessing the climate crisis as we speak that all will be fine, because it is not. In recent months, an area the size of the United Kingdom has flooded Pakistan. Thousands have died and the cost is in the billions. And it's worrying that this is but one example of many I could have chosen from to highlight today. This cycle of disaster rebuild is one which millions are experiencing, and we need to do better. The reality is that if we do not bend the global emissions curve and make deep reductions this decade, we will go beyond the limits of our ability to adapt. In the last 3 years, the UK as COP26 president has tried to be an open and neutral president. Transparency, inclusivity, consistency of message and trust have been our guiding principles. We've also not shied away from being challenging to hold those countries who need to do more to account. And I hope Ambassador Kim, who will speak later in the session, will agree that in the process of pushing Korea for more action and for more urgency, one of the Glasgow legacies is the expanded scope for what we, the UK and Korea, as developed countries can do when we put our collective might together in the face of the climate crisis. Of course, you're right to ask whether this is enough, and whether the progress yielded at Glasgow was evolutionary, revolutionary, or even just a repeat of what went before. I will let you decide. But the primary role of the COP president is to oversee a COP summit, deliver a negotiated outcome, and then drive its implementation in the post-summit presidency year. There was huge skepticism in the international community at the start of the UK presidency about whether we could really make progress on the road to and at Glasgow. Our goal from day one was to garner enough commitments to ensure that we were keeping alive the prospect of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Did we achieve that? An honest appraisal is that this prospect is on life support, but at least it remains within reach. And a similar evaluation is probably fair for our efforts elsewhere, whether on adaptation, on finance, on loss and damage, on empowerment. But out of this progress, we shepherded nearly 200 countries to forge the Glasgow Climate Pact, an agreement which was never an inevitability and was hard fought. Whilst the pact was forged by negotiators in Glasgow, it was built on the back of extraordinary efforts across 2 years of sustained diplomacy. As the UK and other parties collaborated with governments, CEOs, politicians, young people, civil society and indigenous communities in all nations and on all continents, to ensure that decision makers going to Glasgow went with a requirement to deliver maximum ambition and with the expectation that they would be held to account if they did not. As the president and chair of GGGI, Ban Ki-moon, frequently reminds us, there is no planet B, therefore there can be no plan B. We have the Paris Agreement and now we have the Glasgow Climate Pact. Neither are perfect, but it's what we have. No other international framework will supersede these in time to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So we must turn to implementation of these agreements. This means more finance from the public and private sectors to help those countries with the greatest adaptation and mitigation needs. It means delivering emissions reductions set out in NDCs and ratcheting ambition. It means tackling loss and damage by building on our collective progress at COP26, but going further still. The UK believes it is right that this becomes a new agenda item. And perhaps most importantly, it means not abandoning hope. Now is the time to redouble our efforts, resist backsliding, and ultimately go further and faster. For it is without doubt that the solutions to our present energy security challenges and the longer-term climate crisis are one and the same. I do not live on the front lines of the climate crisis, and I cannot speak to what that means for the existences of those who do. I do, however, live here in Korea, in one of the world's wealthiest manufacturing economies, and a country which is critical in providing the technology and resources to the world to combat the climate crisis. And as we redouble our efforts and dissuade any temptation to backslide, I can make one pledge today. In every meeting I take part in, I will continue to challenge leaders from government, industry, finance, the political class, and civil society on how they will deliver on the promises of the Glasgow Climate Pact, because this is how we keep the Glasgow legacy alive. The responses to date around the world are mixed, but I do see a stronger case for hope than despair. Companies here in Korea, like elsewhere, are radically reimagining what it will take to be a responsible 21st century company, and more importantly, what it will take to remain in business. Because we are in a race to zero. Legacy manufacturers of cars relying on internal combustion, such as Hyundai Motors, are leading the global transition to EVs because they equate it with economic survival. That's a really important new dynamic that my team here in Seoul have seen in the last 3 years. And we are seeing a similar story play out across the Korean economy, with the largest conglomerates such as Samsung, SK, and LG focusing on new growth engines in hydrogen fuel cell technology, batteries, and energy efficient technology. Elsewhere in the region, China connected more offshore wind in 2021 than the whole of the rest of the world combined in the last 5 years. Whilst in India, an incredible 10 gigawatts of solar was connected to the grid in 2021 alone. This audience probably knows these facts, but they demonstrate that we are no longer at the project pilot stage. They demonstrate that clean energy development is taking place at a scale that will allow us to begin to hope that global emissions can peak and then accelerate a steep year-by-year decline. And ambition is growing as the world's best and brightest minds drive clean energy innovation. Take, for example, the planned X-Links Morocco-UK power project, a project which aims to use Morocco's vast solar and wind resources to power the UK via the world's longest undersea power cable. And there is more to come, as the vast resources of private capital, $130 trillion alone within the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, becomes more adept at identifying the number and scale of bankable clean energy projects which the market indicates there is demand for. And it's why I will continue to urge my Korean counterparts to develop the K Renewables offer, which positions Korean industry to win a large chunk of the tens of billions of dollars of offshore wind opportunities available globally this decade. There is a role for governments in all of this, and that's why the UK is working with the G7 and the private sector to develop innovative just energy transition partnerships for countries such as Vietnam to accelerate the clean energy transition. And it's why the UK is working with GGGI in Uganda on a hugely important project to enhance coordination and capacity to secure the critical access to climate finance required to meet development needs. But ultimately, we cannot tackle the defining challenge of this century with institutions defined by the last. Alok Sharma, the COP26 president, has called the Bridgetown agenda set out by Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, a compelling call for an overhaul of our global financial architecture. Tackling the existential climate crisis must be at the heart of what multilateral institutions do. And likewise, we cannot tackle the climate crisis without also tackling the interlinked biodiversity crisis. Protecting and restoring the natural world must be the heart of our efforts, for we all now know that there is no 1.5 pathway without nature. As urgent as the removal of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies is the removal of subsidies for harmful practices in agriculture, which damage nature. And as we make more money available for clean energy, we must also make more money available for nature. To deliver on the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use, a coalition of the ambitious, which includes the UK and Korea, have now established the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership. At the heart of the new partnership will be the question of how the world can work together to support the various mechanisms which will be needed to provide the vast scale of finance required to protect and restore the natural wonders of the world, such as the Congo Basin rainforests and peatlands, which absorb 4% of global emissions each year, and such as the Amazon or the vast forests of Indonesia, whilst critically meeting local sustainable economic development needs. The upcoming COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity must be the Paris moment for nature. And we deliver the Glasgow legacy by rekindling the spirit of urgency, collaboration, and compromise which underpinned COP26 at Glasgow, and replicating it at UNFCCC COP27, at CBD COP26, at the G7, at the G20, and all forums essential to driving global ambition. For we must work hard to keep climate action on the agenda now more than ever. We must continue to challenge others and be prepared to accept that we will be challenged in turn on whether our efforts are enough. The voices of young people calling for change must continue to ring in our ears. And we must finally find time to praise outstanding contributions from those around us who are leading the fight against the climate crisis and upholding the Glasgow legacy. As the UK presidency of COP26 draws to a conclusion, I'd like to thank the hugely committed team here at the Global Green Growth Institute, led by Director Frank Reisperman, for not only bringing us together today, but for their outstanding efforts in the last 3 years in driving Glasgow outcomes and now implementation. And in particular, Ambassador Jenny Kim, as a former Deputy Director General of GGGI and now Korea's Climate Ambassador, for the critical role she has and continues to play in driving global ambition. And of course, my thanks to all you joining today who are likewise committed to a cleaner, safer, and more just future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Crooks, for a strong and positive speech. After the other speeches, we may have a little bit of discussion to see indeed what challenges remain, because indeed, despite all those efforts, we know emissions aren't going down as fast as they should. But indeed, we do recognize that the UK, as COP26 president, put in a major effort to push it in the right direction. And thank you for summarizing that. With that, may I hand over to the Ambassador of Egypt to give us a preview of the Egyptian presidency's plans for COP27. Ambassador, please.
Thank you, Frank. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I will be giving an outline of the presidency of the COP27's vision. The COP27 presidency has identified the possible areas for future international climate action after COP26 in Glasgow, which witnessed the finalization of most items under Paris Rulebook. And in this regard, the following elements guided my country's formulation for a vision for COP27. The urgent need to ensure that action on the ground is in line with the collective expectation as outlined in the outcomes of negotiations, taking into consideration that Glasgow COP confirmed the need for quick and at a scale action by 2030. Also, our vision sees the necessity of a human-centric approach that captures the needs and the aspirations of the people, subject to impacts of climate change and consequently the implementation of a just and equitable and transformative pathway under the Paris Agreement that can respond to these needs and calls. Thirdly, speed and scale of actions should be in line with the recommendations and findings provided by the best available science and principles, and fully aligned with what is needed urgently, and both in the short term and also in the medium term. Fourthly, action should be guided by the principles agreed in the Convention and its Paris Agreement, which identified and clarified the common but differentiated the responsibilities and respective capabilities, and thus the implementation through a just action supported by the right instruments and adequate means of implementation. This year is witnessing additional challenges facing the drive for more climate action, particularly in relation to food and energy crisis, finance challenges, growing debt burden, and geopolitical risks, in addition to challenges arising from the COVID-19 economic and social implications. Also, this year is witnessing increase in extreme weather events, and we have seen this in Pakistan, challenging countries' abilities to adapt, resulting in climate-induced loss and damage in many countries, with compounded adverse effects on the most vulnerable. And we have seen the suffering of people around the world in different areas and in different continents. In assessing where we are in relation to climate action, the following elements have been clearly observed by Egypt. A, the developed countries are short of delivering on commitments and pledges to climate finance. Non-delivery of the annual 100 billion USD commitment is just the tip of the iceberg. Additional sources of disappointment are related to challenges facing access to finance, sufficiency of available finance, and focus through the loans as the main instrument. Here it is worth noting that the Standing Committee on Finance under the UNFCCC estimated developing countries need 5.6 trillion USD until 2030 to enable them to deliver on their nationally determined contribution, NDCs. We are also behind on action, be it on adaptation or mitigation. On mitigation, the current levels of action and pledges will not safeguard the Paris Agreement temperature target of well below 2 degrees or keeping even the 1.5 within reach. On adaptation, there persists a finance support gap, driving the implementation gap in translating adaptation plans into climate risks, especially in vulnerable hotspots in developing countries. and impeding efforts to achieve the global goal on adaptation. There are also additional challenges facing developing countries, especially African countries, related to achieving social and economic development goals, including achieving the SDGs. Africa alone is home to 600 million persons with no access to electricity and 900 million people without clean cooking. Meanwhile, additional impacts due to loss and damage resulting the adverse impacts of climate change, with again the example of Pakistan as a case in point, contributes to significant increase in the level of indebtedness of developing countries, making them further unattractive to private investments. According to the UNECA, African countries are paying around 2 to 4% of their GDP to cover the cost of adaptation measures. Also, there are concerns of backtracking or backsliding on existing commitments and pledges made especially by leading and developed countries, both in terms of mitigation and finance pledges under the pretext of the global geopolitical economic challenges. Again, I would like to stress that we should focus on science and principles and stay away from our geopolitical differences. In light of the above, the presidency's vision of COP27 is centered around a COP for implementation. Again, I would like to reiterate this and reaffirm it's a COP for implementation, where we can demonstrate success stories that can be replicated and scaled up, discuss challenges facing the transition to a low carbon, climate resilient pathways, and identify elements for an equitable and just transition. And finally, strengthen the resolve to keep the 1.5-degree target within reach. Also in Egypt, as COP presidency, we are working on 4 different levels, and they are as follows. There will be a summit for the heads of states and governments with the aim to discuss current challenges and to keep climate change on top of the international agenda. In this regard, Egypt is organizing 6 summit-level roundtables under the Sharm el-Sheikh Climate Implementation Summit, SCIS, on the following: just transition, future of energy with a focus on hydrogen, innovative finance for climate and development, climate change and food security, climate change and water security, climate impact on sustainability of communities. B, in the negotiations, the Egyptian presidency is committed to work with all parties to deliver on the following: loss and damage, and respond to the urgent need to find the right arrangements to provide new and additional resources. Mitigation, to ensure a high-level ambition and find pathways for keeping the temperature increase in line with the keeping 1.5 degrees within reach through the implementation and new and updated NDCs. Adaptation, to ensure we are on track to deliver the global goal on adaptation and to deliver on the pledge to double adaptation finance by 2025. And finally, on finance. And again, I will repeat, finance. Finance, we need to deliver new pledges for adaptation fund and to ensure a higher replenishment for the Green Climate Fund, GCF, and to demonstrate an overall progression in finance beyond what was pledged in Glasgow as per the Paris Agreement. Thirdly, on the stakeholders' engagement. Through 11 thematic days, it is imperative to provide an inclusive, meaningful, and conducive environment for private sector. Again, I'll repeat, private sector. I think as governments, we really need to engage with private sectors, academia, civil society, and NGOs. And the buzzword, youth. In my country, more than 50% of the population are under 35. This is just an example of how the youth should be engaged and should be big part of COP27. And they should be part and parcel of all the discussions on how we can deliver pathways that are just and ambitious. It is with noting that Egypt presidency is introducing these 3 thematic days on decarbonization, solutions, and ACE and civil society. Also, we are working with partnership with Egypt Climate Champion, Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin, to bring in projects from different economic commissions and try to match it with finance from different sources. So I hope the international community can put their hands together and work on finding these projects and allocating the funds needed for implementation. In this aspect, Egypt COP presidency strongly believes in the need to tackle the climate emergency. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in an emergency situation, and the existential threat it poses on lives and livelihoods and ecosystems are very clear to all of us. This needs a spirit of solidarity and responsibility. And it's working again. Okay, thank you. We need to achieve a spirit of solidarity and responsibility with the aim to achieve progress on the negotiations and to deliver tangible results for implementation and to work in a cooperative attitude and innovative solutions to deal with the challenges of implementation, in particularly in the areas of finance and adaptation. To close, I would like again just to focus on the role of youth and the younger generation. The coming generation are the ones who are going to suffer from our policies and our decisions. We believe that the voices of the world youth population are instrumental to the decisions that can keep the 1.5 goal alive and contribute to the internationally agreed emissions reduction targets, and eventually to a global net zero by 2050. For these reasons, the needs and priorities of the youth should be fully taken into account in all climate response policies and measures, including mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, climate finance, and responding to loss and damage. Youth should also be at the center of the discussions around just transition and the imperative of addressing the socio-economic dimensions of climate action, including decent job opportunities for young people. The best way to ensure youth-sensitive planning and implementation of response to climate change is through further empowerment and ensuring equitable representation of young people in decision-making process. As agents of change, youth are essential and natural partners to the global climate agenda. In conclusion, I shall seize this opportunity of this gathering to reiterate Egypt's commitment to work closely and cooperate with all international and regional partners to implement climate action, steps, and milestones towards the successful fruition of climate goals, a commitment that is clearly expressed in Egypt's decision to host the COP27 and its efforts to steer the climate agenda towards more inclusion and action orientation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, now you've heard two speeches, one of a president who is almost finished and one for a president with an ambitious agenda. I'm just wondering if maybe the two ambassadors would briefly react to each other's speeches, like Ambassador Crooks. Is there any experience from having done this for a year? And I know you were not Alok Sharma, but you've done a lot of speeches about this, no doubt. Any advice you have for the incoming president from the experience that the UK has had? And yes, after that, Ambassador, I'll ask you also, maybe you have a very ambitious agenda now. Any, if you like, reaction to Ambassador Crook's summary of the COP26? Any area where you think you can improve on their performance? If with those gentle questions, I could ask you to respond just briefly to each other.
Well, thank you very much, Frank, and thank you, Ambassador, for that very clear and comprehensive outline of Egypt's efforts during the year to date, because I know it's a busy year leading up to the COP, but also during the year to come, because I think we have found that the efforts continued very much after the COP that we hosted in Glasgow, and I think will in fact continue beyond that, because we will still remain an engaged and active member of the process. I don't think I would presume to offer advice as such. I certainly wish you good luck and good fortune. It will be an important meeting at Sharm el-Sheikh, and it will be important efforts after that as well. Wish you good luck, and I think it is important to engage all stakeholders. I think that you have set out a very clear plan for doing that, and remembering it's not just for countries, but also for companies in particular. Finance came up. We may talk a little bit more about finance, but I think it is important to remember that finance partly, of course, has to come from governments, and governments must do better. But one of the important roles of governments in finance is to crowd in private sector finance, because if we're going to attract finance on the scale it's needed, we have to be able to shape investments that will yield returns, and that really is the key to unlocking a lot of this. But also civil society, youth, other groups that have mentioned. So not advice as such, but certainly good fortune.
Thank you, Frank. Ambassador Colin. Definitely the pledges in Glasgow are very important for this upcoming year and the presidency of Egypt. We are very keen to implement these pledges, and we are seeing we have no other chance. In Egypt, we see the climate challenge from a historic point of view. I have a vision about the Egyptian ancient civilization. This civilization flourished because the environment helped it to flourish in this part of the world. We had the River Nile, we had clean water, and this ancient civilization flourished and was growing for other civilizations to grow, the Greeks, the Romans, and so on. So I think we are in the same situation now. Our civilization is at stake, and that's why we are very keen on implementation. If we are to survive for the next couple of million years, then we should look how we can implement these policies today. This is just a metaphor that I had coming from a country that has been on the map for over 7,000 years. And definitely the environment was a cause for sustainability for any civilization to grow and flourish scientifically, culturally, and politically and economically. Ambassador Colin, thank you. I believe that we have lessons to be learned from Glasgow, and definitely international cooperation is needed. I know on the bilateral level that Egypt and the UK have been cooperating for the past year since COP26, and we've had several meetings on the highest level my foreign minister, who is the president of COP27, has had many meetings, and we've exchanged views, we've exchanged notes, we've exchanged experience on the way forward. Also, being here as ambassador of Egypt in Korea, I look forward to engage with the Korean government and with the Korean private sector. We are calling for a lot of projects to be implemented. One of them is production of hydrogen. I know Korean companies, they have a lot of expertise in this field. And also we have a number of Korean companies already present in Egypt on the bilateral base, and they are manufacturing in Egypt. And we need to work together to engage the private sector. The private sector, the youth, and the NGOs and the civil society have to be partners, because they are also facing these challenges with us. We as governments, we can take the decisions, but how to implement it in a public-private partnership is the solution for our survival and for the coming generations. We have to learn to work together as governments with the private sector on how to achieve goals that are sustainable and for the livelihood of societies and communities. Thank you.
Both speakers, thank you very much. With that, I think the two perspectives from the two presidents, we will introduce two new speakers, both Ambassador Kim, Jenny, speaking for Korea, and we've also seen Madame Madeleine Diouf, the LDC chair, online, so we'll hear from both of you. And indeed, first, Jenny, I think before COP26, it was quite clear. We had several visits from President Alok Sharma and a number of others who were pushing Korea to step up. And indeed, we were all hoping that Korea would make a commitment that at least had a 4 in it. And we were very happy that the president in the end did. So now, what is the road to COP27? What are the expectations both of Korea and from Korea for COP27? Can we please hand over the floor to you?
Thank you, Frank. First of all, please allow me to join previous speakers by expressing my sincere gratitude to the Global Green Growth Institute for organizing this meaningful session about COP27, which will begin in 2 weeks in Sharm el-Sheikh. Today, we are observing and feeling an increasing impact of climate change day by day, even in Korea as well. So extreme weather events take place surpassing our expectation. Let me just take one example. Seoul metropolitan city experienced the record rainfall this summer, which is believed to be the heaviest in last 115 years. Amid 2 days of chaos, the torrential rain caused huge floods and damaged homes, buildings, subway stations, and vehicles. So tens of people died. 600 people were forced to evacuate their homes, and 12 automobile damage insurance companies received more than 2,700 claims for flooded cars just one overnight. So according to experts, Seoul City's drainage system has been designed to accommodate on average 80 milliliters rainfall per hour. Some areas with new construction can accommodate up to 100 milliliters per hour rainfall. However, on that night, heavy rain of 140 milliliters per hour inundated Seoul's Gangnam Station area, which is absolutely beyond the capacity of current infrastructure. So that incident really provided an alarming signal to Korea and asked Korea to review the current infrastructure system from the very beginning. So we need to integrate climate crisis factor and mainstream that factor in our infrastructure designing. Of course, this is just a small example in comparison with many extreme weather cases around the globe. So, and COP27 will take place in 2 weeks. It will happen as global leaders are struggling with many other issues, as already explained by the previous ambassadors. So I think it's really challenging for COP27 to produce good outcome. As Russia's invasion of Ukraine have sent food and energy prices soaring to record highs, there are concerns that all of this could impact the level of ambition and might lead to distraction of the climate change. World leaders can be easily tempted to pay more attention on other imminent issues like energy crisis or food crisis. However, all the climate catastrophic disasters happened last year, this year, strongly and urgently demand us to make this COP27 Glasgow plus. I say Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 must be Glasgow plus. So we have to review very carefully what we agreed in Glasgow and what progress we have made for last 1 year and what additional commitments and targets we are going to agree in this Sharm el-Sheikh COP. So Glasgow Climate Pact confirmed the 1.5 degree within reach as shared target. Countries promised to work for achieving net zero by the middle of this century and submit upgraded 2030 NDC in accordance with 1.5 degrees Celsius ambition. So we agreed to accelerate our implementation. And developed countries announced to increase their adaptation finance and strengthen the efforts to meet the target of 100 billion climate finance mobilization as early as possible. This is all what we agreed in Glasgow. And also leaders in Glasgow, they agreed, like leaders' declaration on forestation, climate technology and development, and innovation. Many other initiatives were launched in Glasgow. So we have to review carefully, as I mentioned earlier, we have to review carefully what additional actions and efforts we have made to effectively implement those promises, announcements, and targets. First of all, I would like to emphasize the significant role of IPCC's sixth assessment report, particularly the contribution of Working Group 3 contribution released this year in making Sharm el-Sheikh deliverables. So when UNFCCC member countries representatives gather together and discuss about what deliverables we are going to produce in Sharm el-Sheikh, we must bear in mind the key messages IPCC authors sent to us, particularly in Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 reports. According to the IPCC, we must reach an emission peak before 2025. So all countries must look at their emission so-called pathway in the future, and then must think about what additional actions to be taken to reach at the peak of the emission before the year of 2025. And at COP27, we are going to discuss about mitigation work program, which is called MWP, which will be an effective mechanism to collectively facilitate strong mitigation implementation efforts. By adopting this mitigation work program, we can send a clear signal, we can send a clear message, particularly to the private sector, where they have to invest and where they have to put their money and what technology they are going to develop for the future. I mean, there are different views about the scope, about the principles, and about the contents of this mitigation work program. So developing countries, they have ideas about this mitigation program, and developed countries, they have different ideas about the content and scope of this mitigation work program. But the key is we must agree this mitigation work program. This is one of the elements of Glasgow Plus. And secondly, scale up support for adaptation is important in this COP as well. Last year, developed countries agreed to double their adaptation finance by 2025 based on the year of 2019. So at this COP27, developed countries must look at how much progress they have made for last year and how well they are preparing themselves to effectively implement this commitment. In addition to that, we have to discuss about global goal on adaptation at this Sharm el-Sheikh meeting. So it's a Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh discussion, how to define global goal on adaptation. And there are many elements discussed about this goal, because adaptation is very locally led process. So it's difficult to make a definition about global goal on adaptation. However, UNFCCC members, we have a shared view that we must support the locally led adaptation, and we must support local communities, and we must build the capacity of local community players. And based on that principle, we must make a progress in forging global goal on adaptation. Finally, at this COP, accelerating the efforts to meet 100 billion climate finance and financing mechanism for addressing loss and damage will be critical barometer of trust between developed and developing countries. I think macroeconomic situation is really unfavorable, very frankly speaking. Many developed countries, they are doing their utmost to achieve this 100 billion climate finance target as early as possible. Many countries, even though under economic downturn, they are increasing their development assistance, particularly their green ODA. Korea is one of those countries who will increase official development assistance for next year, and also the portion of green ODA. However, because of strong dollar, so exchange rate really gives an impact to this efforts. So personally, I have a concern as well, because Korean government proposal for next year's ODA, we significantly increased our ODA volume. However, because of the strong dollar, in reality, next year, how much we can increase in dollar terms. So that is my concern as well, because already the government is struggling due to the exchange rate. The government budget is in deficit. However, as previous ambassadors already mentioned, we must mobilize private sector's investment in climate areas, and it's a good signal that more and more, particularly Korean companies and commercial banks, they are interested in. They have strong enthusiasm to work in this area. That's why for this COP27, Korean representatives from private sector, commercial bank, youth groups, civil society leaders, all of them, they will be in Sharm el-Sheikh. And also due to the very busy diplomatic schedules such as G20 summit meeting, APEC summit meeting, and ASEAN Plus summit meeting, unfortunately, Korean president cannot fly to Sharm el-Sheikh. However, he's going to send a presidential special envoy for climate and environment, Madam Na Kyung-won, who is very high profile politician. She will be there on behalf of the president. Although there are challenges in front of us, particularly from the perspective of macroeconomic situation, I'm sure that we are going to produce good and balanced Glasgow Plus outcome in Sharm el-Sheikh, and Korea is ready to contribute in that efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for staying optimistic despite all the challenges you just described. And I think we are lucky that we have one more perspective. I think I saw before the LDC chair, Madame Madeleine Diouf from Senegal, online as well. I think she'll have a maybe slightly different perspective from the developing countries going to Sharm el-Sheikh. So, Madeleine, Madame Diouf, are you able to open the camera, and can we give the floor to you? We see her online, but the camera is not on right now and the microphone is muted. There you are. Madame Diouf, the floor is to you when you're ready. We can see you. Your microphone is still muted.
Okay. Sorry, Mr. Frank. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to join you in the road to COP27. I am speaking as LDC chair, actually in Senegal, and I just want also to give the perspective from NDCs regarding the COP27. For LDCs, COP27 is really important. COP, we expect really to come out with a key principal outcome. As you know, time is running, so we need really to maintain the global warming to 1.5 degrees. And this limit was been agreed in Paris 7 years ago. But we are far to respect such a global warming limit. And COP27 will be an opportunity to refresh countries, in particular bigger emitter, major polluter, to be more ambitious and deliver a revised plan to cut the carbon emission as agreed last year in Glasgow. And Her Excellency Jenikin has bring that on the table. Why is important? Actually, we saw that the tendency is if you maintain the tendency, we're going to reach 2.7 degree warming this century. And we already see the impact of climate change in developing countries, particularly in LDC's countries. We are suffering already due to climate change. It's why we do things that also the topic and the big pillar related to loss and damage is critical for COP27 in Egypt. We were starting discussing loss and damage funding arrangement in Glasgow, but we were not able to finalize it. There was an agreement to move to a dialogue on loss and damage. It's the Glasgow dialogue, but we need to revise the format of the dialogue. I think it's a long time ago we're talking about loss and damage. We see now loss and damage happening in communities, happening in least developing countries, happening in Africa, happening in small islands and in many developing countries. So there is now time to set up a clear funding arrangement on loss and damage. IPCC has been say that loss and damage is already here. We haven't provided the resources available or the resources required to adapt to climate change. We need more for climate change because temperature is increasing, but also we're already facing loss and damage. So in COP27, we really look that all communities will come up with taking consciously in an appropriate manner the funding of loss and damage. As all developing countries, LDCs is expecting, and has been said by Her Excellency from Egypt Ambassador, the loss and damage finance arrangement need to be established. We're looking for finance facilities, but we do things that giving such outcome will give to the poor communities more confidence on our negotiation process. We want also as LDC to talk about the finance of adaptation. As LDC, we only receive less than 6 billion in total for adaptation. It's studies done to show that from 2018 to now, LDCs receive less than 3% of the fund need for adaptation. We are the most vulnerable. We have our economy who need to be adjusted due to climate change. We have our country facing some debt due to finance in order really to respect the need of communities, the urgent need of communities caused by climate extreme events. We have a lot of flooding. We know that some countries are facing drought, water scarcity, sea erosion. I can make a big list, what's going on. So there's a lot of problem in many LDCs countries, in many communities, in developing countries due to climate impact. So saying that, we expect that the doubling of climate finance will be also, in particular for adaptation, will be considered. We look for having some ministerial discussion on the road, on the way forward, on effectively doubling the adaptation finance has been decided in Glasgow. We also expect that clear roadmap will be provided regarding the achievement of a 100 billion. We were supposed to finalize in 2020, but promise has not yet respected. But we expect to have a clear vision by 2025 to achieve this 100 billion. We also, as LDCs, working around keeping the 1.5 alive, and the discussion around the mitigation work program is key. We want to be part of this discussion on the mitigation work program. We want this program to allow really to achieve this goal of 1.5, but also sustain the implementation of NDCs in developing countries. And this requires means of implementation. We have our NDC on the table. We need finance in order to make this NDC implemented. And it's also a way for also achieving this 1.5. We look for a big emitter to take more ambitious target in COP27 in order really to keep this 1.5. I think it's a necessity for the world. This climate crisis requires from us in COP27 to take appropriate decision in order really to minimize the climate impact that communities are facing, poorest communities are facing. They are victims. They are the less emitter. For LDCs is 1% of emission from 46 countries. So it's a matter of climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Diouf, as chair of the LDCs. I think your expectations are high, in line with that of the COP26 presidency. Well, I would love to have a bit more extended conversation among these four speakers. We were, I think, very lucky that we had speakers representing the COP26 and COP27 presidency, as well as Korea and the LDCs as key participants in COP27. But as time is running, and we're actually running over a bit, and we also have a panel, I hope that our past speakers understand that it's time to move on to the multi-stakeholder speakers that we have. We have representatives from industry and from indigenous groups, and also more representing Africa from GGGI, in fact. So with that, I'd like to shift from the speakers we just heard to our panel. We have three ladies who will represent, well, Samsung, the private sector, In-hee Chang, former colleague from GGGI. We also have Bhavna Chowdhury, the founder and principal coordinator of the Indigenous, clearly speaking on behalf of indigenous groups. And we'll have Nagnume Kone, who works in GGGI's Africa regional office. So can I have these three perspectives? And I think we had longer questions, but it is really your perspective from your group of COP27. What are you expecting to see in COP27? And In-hee, could we start with the private sector that has already been referred to? High expectations. The trillions will have to come not from the government, but from the private sector. So
sure.
Starting right there. Please.
Thank you, Frank. And it's good to be back at the GGGI office. So having been with the private sector for about over 2 years now, I'm definitely seeing a lot of attention and actually investment as well in climate, and not just climate, actually, in resource circularity. So I guess for COP27, speaking for Korean industries in particular, because we are in the race to zero and we're looking at both all three scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. I mean, scope 2 is the most challenging for many Korean, I guess, based industries, given the electricity market being what it is. And RE100 transition is very much requested by key stakeholders like the investors, the clients. So, you know, moving towards this net zero for us is imperative. It's not just something nice to have, but it's absolutely a business decision that comes from the highest levels. So yes, from my expected from COP27, I mean, we mentioned partnership. There's no doubt that this alone, one company alone, one sector alone cannot achieve this goal. It has to be done in collaboration, in partnership. And the role that I play at Samsung is actually to forge those partnerships so that we are working together with governments, with international organizations, with NGOs, and with the local partners who are ready to support on implementation. So I guess, in a nutshell, the COP27 expectation is, especially for the Asian market, I mean, we're not just operating in Korea alone. We have a big complex in Vietnam, which is also quite a challenging market. So especially in the Asia region, we understand that RE transition is still quite a bit of a way to go. And we feel that government leadership, there's a role for the government to play. And of course, private sector, I think, is pretty ready to jump in to the discussion and to the implementation. And RE100, the climate group, is taking also leadership in getting the suppliers and the off-takers, the buyers together with financiers to form a platform. I understand there might be some events during COP27 to actually launch this. So there are multiple activities already happening at the moment that private sector is very much involved. And I think it's just a matter of getting that expectation alignment together and make sure that especially the RE transition is supported by the government and also by the international community.
Well, Annie, that's very interesting. Having been on panels with the Korean private sector for the last 5-6 years, I think you could probably see there is a pretty rapid transition where from companies saying, well, sorry, it's very difficult, to actually saying net zero is a business imperative. That's almost, flipping the coin, right? So indeed, does Samsung feel that its stakeholders, its clients, its investors want it to be net zero before 2050?
They're not prescriptive in how we get there, obviously, but they do want it to be science-based. So SBTi is very much asked of, but there are some sectors where this is not easy, given that SBTi it's not fit for all sectors, and maybe that's where sectoral approach needs to happen. But definitely investors, I mean, BlackRock is a classic example where Larry Fink has been sending letters to all CEOs that BlackRock has a stake in to really step up on their greenhouse gas carbon decarbonization efforts. And it's not just BlackRock, actually. I've been taking part in what we call ESG non-deal roadshows, which is basically having an engagement chat with the investors of the company. And they basically ask questions about, okay, so what is your climate goal? How are you going to get there? And is there a mid to long-term target? What is your trajectory? Is it science-based? These are very, very specific questions they ask. And if we're not, quite there, it's not that they're going to penalize or anything, but they engage, they mean the investors. So they have an engagement plan with their portfolio of companies. So they are doing their part. Obviously, as a manufacturing sector, there's a lot of now regulation that's being a big pressure, especially from the EU side. The EU has put out all sorts of regulations. Of course, the Green Deal was the starting point. But on the climate side, it's quite obvious. But more on the resource circularity side, the Sustainable Product Initiative is asking for recyclable content in products to be a mandatory requirement. And I think that's starting with the automotive sector, but it'll expand to other products. The battery regulation directive is looking at the sourcing aspect of batteries, whether the minerals are coming from, conflict areas or where the child labor is being used. So not just on the environment side, on the social side, and the intersection of the two. So it's getting very complex, and the legislation and policies are getting very, very detailed. So the companies have to actually act. Otherwise, they cannot sell their products in certain markets. And this is very true for Korean companies where we have operations not just in this region, but in the US and Europe. So this is a matter of a survival, business survival. And of course, we want to make this into a business competitiveness to really go a bit ahead of the curve. Yeah, so I'll just stop right there.
Well, frankly, I think that's very encouraging to feel that the private sector feels that pressure. I think that is what we need if we can mobilize, the whole society beyond the 100 billion. That is the first goal. Now, if we can move to Bhavna Chaudhary, I don't think anybody expects the indigenous communities to come up with the trillions, as I asked Inhi. But on the other hand, COP26 did recognize that indigenous people and local communities have actually a very important role to play and have a lot of knowledge that can be critical and actually have adapted to changing climates for very long times. So maybe can you share what your view is on COP27 and how you expect maybe the different stakeholders to recognize the role that indigenous communities can and should play? Bhavna.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm honored to be here amongst the brightest and the most important leaders of our generation who would perhaps give us a chance to share our perspectives. So I actually have a small, short presentation. Thank you so much. So we can just go a little bit to the next slide. It's kind of to give a perspective of where we are at today. So this is a map from Global Forest Watch. And here we see where the last remaining primary forests of the world are in terms of tree cover. You see the Amazon basin, you see the Congo basin, and you see Indo-Burma. These are also the regions of the world which have the largest biodiversity hotspots, so the 37 last biodiversity hotspots with over 2 million species of rich species in the region. And the yellow and red spots are locations that have emerged between 2002 and 2021 of massive deforestation. This is extremely challenging for us to look at because in a way you're looking at a map, a global map that says, look, this is where the last primary forests of the world are, and we are going and destroying what's there because we are not valuing what is important at the global level, at an international level. So if you move to the next slide, the perspective here also is that there is an overlap between those very areas and where indigenous peoples live. You are looking at a systems approach where we're saying that the same areas that are under preservation and under conservation that remain intact are indigenous territories, who represent 80% of the management of all primary forests on the planet. This map is from the Endangered Languages Project, and it shows all of the different languages that are going to become extinct due to several factors. I will not go into them. And on the right, you have a snapshot of where I come from. I belong to a Thai Ahom indigenous community in Northeast India, and it is the Indo-Burma region, one of the 37 biodiversity hotspots. And in 2020, between 2004 and 2022, we've had over $500 million worth of illegal coal mining in our region. This is the glaring perspective that we are looking at. So I'd like to kind of just move on from this and share with you what we have done as an organization. You can stop presenting, thank you. Is the fact that the reason why many of these same issues overlap is because there is no systems approach to the climate issue. By that, I mean that indigenous peoples are regarded as a major group, as a stakeholder, but there is a separate conference on biodiversity, a separate conference on infrastructure, on involving the private sector. But when we look at the systems approach, there is overlapping work that is done in the international agenda that could have greater synergies. So in general, the response of the Global North has been to create new institutions to respond to the same crisis. And we have seen that that does not work. So what does work? What works is active mass mobilization, which the youth across the planet have shown of how they're able to do that. They're able to do that. They're able to mobilize at massive capacity because they're connected to the internet. And we have been able to do the same. At the Indigenous, we work with over 50 Indigenous groups. And on the lead up to Stockholm Plus 50, we had a round of consultations with over 3,000 peoples in over 60 languages. So this was possible because we have the networks within Indigenous groups to be able to give us those answers. Now, what we need is what has been echoed throughout this entire session is the need for finance. So what we see is that the GCF has, well, through the GCF, the UK and many of the others here have pledged up to $1.7 billion for Indigenous peoples, out of which less than 2% has gone to Indigenous peoples directly. This was in 2020. And we are now at 2022. In the RED program, less than 15 of the organizations actually work with Indigenous peoples directly. So the financing that has been mobilized from your side has not reached us. That is where we stand today. And this is what needs to change. We need the GCF to open up to organizations that are able to mobilize at a global level. We need the RED program to be extended, a RED Plus program to be extended, and we need the ability to connect local adaptation plans with global agendas. And today I'm not here as an activist. I know that I tend to be pretty forward in the way that I speak, but today I'm really here to kind of offer solutions, and the solutions are that the commitments that have been made should go to Indigenous peoples directly. And this is what we've been working on through our programs. We found that on the internet itself, like, you know, there's over 7,000 languages, but 60% of global volume of the internet is in the English language. So there's a big gap of what actually exists in terms of nature-based solutions, in terms of solutions that exist that do not reach the English-speaking community, that do not get to getting a chunk of that cake of the 1.7 billion and more than the 100 billion that has been promised. So this is kind of where we are at today. And in order to move forward from this, what we need is a direct mechanism from COP27 that engages with Indigenous communities directly. So this is my perspective on COP27.
Thank you. I think it's a very good reminder that while we may try to bring in different stakeholders, that some key stakeholders are feeling left out, if I can summarize, but knocking on the door and indeed making it clear that you want a seat at the table. I thought that was very, very helpful. Now, Norma, if I may come to you, originally we had a longer question, but maybe, you know, speaking a bit for Africa and for our members in Africa, can you say what you think they would like out of COP27? And I know maybe particularly talk a bit about loss and damage that we have talked about before, but just kind of new still. Everybody knows about mitigation and adaptation, but why is loss and damage so important for our members, particularly in Africa?
So thank you so much. I think that's a very pertinent question, especially in the context of 2022, having come from COVID and now post-COVID. And we also have a global phenomenon that's happening, the conflict in Ukraine and in Russia, and how that trickles down into the region, the African region. And we also have the issue of climate change. So this COP, particularly being in Africa, is going to be extremely important. And it is important in the sense that we have to be extremely innovative in the solutions that we come up with, because these solutions are going to be long-term and they have to be sustainable, they have to be rigid, and they have to be solid. Most importantly, they have to be important in responding to the needs of the people. The ambassador of Egypt just mentioned earlier that loss and damage is extremely important in for Africa. And the presidency of Egypt has actually mentioned that this COP will do its best to bring loss and damage to the table. Now, we all ask ourselves, why do they have to do their best to bring loss and damage to the table? And that has been because since the agreement, the Paris Agreement, which has Article 8 on loss and damage, it has been difficult for developing countries, for the seeds, and also for the G77 to actually bring loss and damage to the table at the COP. In COP26, when they tried to bring that facility, the financial facility for assisting developing countries and countries in transition also, and as well as the seeds, to have compensation on the impacts of the climate change on their economy, on the youths, on the women, that was actually swept away really well to becoming a Glasgow dialogue that still doesn't have implications on how it's going to be rolled out. So basically, the challenge between having a financial mechanisms that assists the people or the communities and the continents that had the least contribution to climate change has been very difficult, and that shouldn't be the case, because it basically means that without compensation, the countries that have contributed the least have to bear the brunt of it, and they have to do it alone, and it's impossible. It's impossible because if you are supposed to bridge the gap to 1.5, and there is no financial mechanism to do that, to not only develop effective policies and mechanisms, but to build also the capacity of the local governments to be able to contribute towards socioeconomic development, then it's impossible to get to that gap of 1.5, because you need finances. The finances are really pretty much the fuel that runs the economy. And also, when we talk about the loss and damage and the financial implications of that, and the lack of reaction, especially from developed countries, to consider that it's pertinent that these resources are put in place, and promising that you're going to provide billions, yet only 10% trickle down to developing countries, especially the African region, is it's quite a challenge. Because when we meet ourselves at COP and we say that, okay, we have to bring the SDGs, we have to achieve them. To achieve them, it actually needs processes, it actually needs the tools, and the tools here we're talking about is the resources. So why is loss and damage important for Africa? Recently, if we move beyond Africa and we go to Pakistan, the stretch, they did not have the capacity to deal with the floods. And we have at least 1 million people, I think that's what I heard yesterday, that are still struggling to find livelihoods. Now, when we move from Asia, we come to Africa, we look at the map that Bhavna just provided. You look at the Western Africa, we have the impact of climate change that is also causing food insecurity. Now, this is not this has not been caused by the people in the Sahel, but they have to face this challenge. And they can face the challenge. They can face the challenge when the resources are available. They can face the challenge if the resources are given in a timely manner, just like Bhavna just mentioned, and just like the ambassador of Egypt actually mentioned. So loss and damage is really important. And I do believe that if we come to this COP27 and somehow loss and damage is not tabled, it will be not an African COP, and it may not be a successful COP. And as Honorable Jenny Kim mentioned, that it has to be Glasgow plus. I think the plus is the aspect that we need to look back as to what was on the table at first by the G7 team, and what was brought back by the LDCs in terms of having a tools and a mechanism to ensure that they can adapt. And this was actually swept away. It is going back to those challenges and fixing them for a much more sustainable and effective future, not only for Africa speaking, but also for the least developed countries, the seeds. Now, when we go to enhancing the efforts to implement adaptation measures, they also require resources. When you look at the bottlenecks of what are the challenges and the solution, it's an issue of resources. So if we have to achieve SDGs, the first thing we have to do is how do we fix the financial mechanism for loss and damage and ensure that we roll it out immediately and effectively as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Naguma. I think we were lucky to have had a whole series of very eloquent speakers who have given us very different perspectives from where they sit in the spectrum on what is expected for COP27. I was impressed that all the speakers managed to still find some optimism and some positive perspective, despite the very long list of expectations and challenges, frankly, Ambassador of Egypt, that are, there's a very high weight, I think, of expectations on the shoulders of the COP27 chair. But as you have said, the COP27 chair can only orchestrate the overall effort. The contributions will have to come from all the countries that have to come to the table, willing to make progress, to get to the plus in the Glasgow plus. And yes, we know that, as has been said by almost all of the speakers here, finances are going to be critical. And it's a very unfavorable climate, I think, as Jenny said. Most countries are struggling to meet their own budgets. So it's not going to be easy to see how there can be a Glasgow plus in Sharm el-Sheikh. But I do know that many people will go there with their own personal energy and commitment. And yes, if we look at our own experience, there are positive signs. I think the fact that the private sector is more and more engaged, as we heard from Samsung here, and that is, I think, representative of others in the private sector as well. In the end, we'll have to use the scarce ODA resources to leverage a much larger amount of private sector resources. We'll have to get smarter in using ODA resources. I know that developing countries want more grants, and that was one reaction to the JET-P proposal from South Africa. On the other hand, if we use $1 from a grant, it's only $1. If we use $1 of ODA to mobilize 10 or 15 from the private sector, then we may be able to go from billions to trillions. So yeah, technically there are solutions that are even commercially attractive or near commercially attractive. We keep hearing that the private sector not only has challenges, but opportunities. So I think somewhere in there is hopefully a viable way forward. And the best thing we can do is try and bring all those good ideas together and try and find the best energy and the best efforts that we can bring to the table to COP27. So let me wrap it up with that. We've come to the end of our time. Let me thank all the speakers and all of you for participating. And I think many of you may either go to COP or send your best wishes, your good vibes to COP, and particularly wish the COP president, Egypt, all the best in hopefully succeeding to bring Sharm el-Sheikh to become Glasgow Plus. Thank you very much.